Acts chapter 7. We're thankful to be in the service. We're thankful to see each one that's here. If you're here and visiting with us, we thank you so much for coming to be with us this morning. Acts chapter 7. I want to begin reading in verse 30. Acts chapter 7. I'm going to begin reading in verse 30. I'm going to do this kind of odd. I don't want to read the whole message that Stephen preached. It's pretty lengthy. Well, I say it's pretty lengthy. It's, I don't know, somewhere around 60 verses, something of that nature. Reading it, that's pretty lengthy. If he was to stand up and say all this, it wouldn't take him probably about 5 minutes. And they say, well, that was a short message, But Stephen had a whole lot to say, and a wonderful message. Now, this morning, I'm going to read maybe 2 little excerpts from it, and the main gist of it, so that you can kind of see a picture of what Stephen preached. It's kind of an odd message, and I ask you this morning, please hang with me. When I get done, I want you to see a picture of something that maybe a little bit of supposition this morning, but I honestly, I don't believe much. A lot of times when we study history, we kind of study it in such a way that you're thinking about maybe one particular part of history. If you study the Civil War, you kind of think about what's going on only in America. But when you begin to look at everything that's happening in the world at the same time, you begin to get a clearer picture of so much that's taking place. And there's a lot of things that are happening at one time, and we don't always get to look at history that way. We don't always get to see things that way. When we look at the Bible from that perspective, it's very much real. There's a lot of things that are going on at the same time here. A lot of things that's taking place. Let's just read the Bible and trust this will get a little clearer as we go forward. Verse 30. And when the 40 years were expired, there appeared unto him, that's Moses, there appeared unto him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire in a bush. And when Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight. And as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Lord came unto him, saying, I am the God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then Moses trembled, and durst not behold. Then said the Lord to him, Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. I have seen the affliction of my people, which is in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and am come down to deliver them. And now come, I will send thee into Egypt. This Moses, whom they refused, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. Let me stop right there for just a moment. What Stephen is saying and reminding them of is that Moses spent, his life could be divided into 3 sections of 40 years. 40 years he spent in Pharaoh's house. 40 years he spent in the wilderness. And 40 years he spent leading the children of Israel. In the 40 years, or after the 40 years in Pharaoh's house, Moses went, now a lot of this Stephen preached, Moses went to look and to see about his people. And he found an Egyptian man that was being overly mean, I guess for a better word, lack of a better word, to one of the Hebrew people, and Moses killed him. And Moses came back the next day and began to give some commands to the Hebrew people. And they said, who sent you to be a ruler and a judge over us? What are you going to do? kill us like you did that Egyptian? And Moses realized that he had been found out, and that Pharaoh, had he known, would kill him. And so Moses left and ran for his life and went and stayed in the wilderness for 40 years. They rejected him. And then Moses came back 40 years later, and they received him. And this is a picture of Christ that Stephen is bringing out for us. They rejected Christ, and Christ will one day return, and they will receive him, and he will be their deliverer, and all of Israel shall be saved in that time. And so he's giving us this picture. Now, let's go back and read verse 35 again. He says, and this Moses, whom they refused, saying, who made thee a ruler and a judge? The same did God send to be ruler and deliverer by the hand of the angel which appeared to him in the bush. Verse 36. He brought them out after that he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. This is that Moses which said unto the children of Israel, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear. This is he that was in the church in the wilderness, which the angel spake of him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, who received the lively oracles to give unto us. Now I'm going to skip on down, come on down to verse 46. He's talking about David now. And he says, who found favor before God and desired to find a tabernacle for God of Jacob. But Solomon built him an house, howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands, as the prophets, as saith the prophet. Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. And what house will ye build me, saith the Lord? Or what is the place of my rest? Hath not my hand made all these things? All right, that's basically the conclusion of Stephen's message. They stopped their ears. They would not hear what Stephen had to say. They gather up. They prepare to kill him. The Bible tells us, even the Bible tells us, even in the end of chapter 6, that as he's standing there, his face shone like an angel. Here's Stephen. By the way, Stephen's a deacon. Stephen wasn't a preacher. What Stephen is doing is he's defending himself. Because they've gathered up a couple of witnesses against him, and they're saying, you've said some bad things about Moses. You've said some things about Moses that are not true. What do you have to say for yourself? In fact, if you look at verse 1 of chapter 7, then said the high priest, are these things so? They're asking Stephen this. Is this really what you said? Did you say this about Moses? Well, Stephen begins to defend himself before the council. His face shines like an angel, and the Lord is preaching through Stephen. Now, I want y'all to remember something. Let's get a picture of what's going on here now. Stephen is standing before the Sanhedrin council. You hear the term Pharisees. This is the greatest of the great, the Sanhedrin council. The Pharisees and some Sadducees as well. This is about maybe the latter 30s AD. At the latest. Why is that important? Because Jesus has just been crucified. And the same men that orchestrated the crucifixion of Jesus Christ are now orchestrating the stoning of Stephen. It's the same men. Maybe one or two different. Maybe some things had taken place politically. Maybe there were a few people. But for the most part, this is the same group of people. And now they're orchestrating the death of Stephen for this thing that Stephen has said. Maybe he said some things about Moses that they claim was blasphemy. There's another man there, as Stephen is defending himself, a man who, if he were not on the Sanhedrin council, were at least up for it as soon as a position opened up, and that's a man named Saul. And he's there. We know he's there because he held the garments of the people who stoned Stephen. And they say that Saul consented unto his death. And what does that mean? I don't know exactly what that means. I wonder if Saul didn't have, maybe he wasn't a part of the council itself, but maybe he had authority from the council. We know that he did receive authority from the council later on, and he took letters with him as he would go to Damascus to kill the church. We get a picture of who this man is. And Saul's here. That's the point. And as you hear this message that I've read to you this morning, in Stephen's defense of himself before the Sanhedrin council, Saul's listening to this as well. So let's think for just a minute about who was. Probably most of us know a little bit about Paul. But who was Saul? Who was Saul? We know him as a man from Tarsus. Saul was a Jewish man. We know a few things about how he grew up because of what he tells us in some of his letters. He would have been a man who was, as he described himself, very much depending upon his genealogy, as he is of the tribe of Benjamin. He's a Pharisee. He tells us that as touching the righteousness of the law, blameless. What does that mean? Does that mean he was not righteous before God at all? But that means if you looked at Paul's life, Saul lived a very good life. He was a very deeply religious man. Touching, he says of himself, touching zeal, he said persecuting the church. What does that mean? Zealous. What does it mean to be zealous? Zealous is the opposite of a procrastinator. If you weren't waiting on Paul, Paul was ready to go. When it came to the Lord's work, Paul was ready to serve. When it came to the Lord's work, Saul was ready to go. Now this all before he saved. So much so that he was willing to have Stephen stoned. Now he wasn't saved. He didn't know Jesus as the Christ. And Saul thought he was, now get this, Saul thought he was doing God a favor by killing the church. Getting rid of these men. Remember what the law had said. And you go back and remember of what happened with Achan. And here Paul is doing nothing more than trying to carry out those orders of the law to kill these men. Paul was a man who was taught the Scriptures. He studied the law under a man named Gamaliel, who was one of the greatest teachers of the law. Saul grew up a wealthy man. They were rich. Had to have been a Pharisee of his stature in society. Why is all of that important? Because Paul knew the Bible. Paul was not a man that had just had the wool pulled over his eyes, so to speak. He was a very logical person. He was taught the law. He was a lawyer to a degree. If not one by position or by trade, he had the mental ability to do it. He knew it that well. Paul no doubt knew and had heard of Jesus Christ before this point. Sometimes I wonder if maybe Paul was involved or at least present at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. I have no evidence to show that anyway, but I believe he was. Why is all that? Because all of this is running through Paul's mind. They killed a lot of people. The Sanhedrin Council did. They killed a lot of people before Jesus. They killed Judas of Galilee. They killed Theudas. We know for sure. The Bible tells us this. They killed a lot of men. But as we know by the Scripture, there was something different about Jesus. And when they killed him, even the Roman centurion said, surely this man was the Christ. All this is going through Paul's head. And then Stephen stands up and defends himself before the Sanhedrin Council in this way. They stopped their ears up. Now, why did they do that? Have you ever been in a time where you were in a logical battle, a debate? I don't want to call it an argument, although this is probably what it is. They're in a legal discussion. Stephen is doing his best to defend himself so that he not die, but he is standing for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Have you ever been in a debate? And you're talking with somebody, and you feel tempted to put your fingers in your ears, like a child, and say, la, 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 la. You know, you just, I'm not, why do you do that? Because you've reached the point that you know you're wrong. You have reached the point that you can no longer defend your belief. You are defeated, and you have nothing else to do but go back to childish nature and stop up your ears and holler like a youngin'. And that's what the council is doing. You go back to chapter 6. If you go back there, I'm sorry, chapter 7, I told you wrong. Verse 57 says that they cried out with a loud voice and stopped their ears and ran upon him with one accord. We can't defeat him anymore. We're just going to have to kill him. Well, that's what they do. Why is that important? Because Paul is a logical man. Paul's a man that thinks. He's a lawyer. And Stephen just defeated him. Stephen just beat him in a debate about Jesus Christ and whether or not he was the Christ. So much so that the Sanhedrin Council cannot defend themselves and their belief system against Stephen, this man who is a deacon of the church at Jerusalem. Y'all think that set well with Saul? You think it nagged at him in the back of his mind? These men knew the Bible. Man, they knew the Bible. The Pharisees knew the Old Testament scriptures. They had a belief about Moses that pretty much they looked at Moses the way we look at Christ. They put him Moses way too high. And that's why they're doing this to Stephen. He had said something about Moses. But notice what Stephen did. Stephen said, and this is kind of me telling you, Stephen said, don't take my word for it, take Moses' word for it. Verse 37, he says, this is the Moses which said unto the children of Israel, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. These last four words, what did he say? Him shall ye hear. Listen to him. Wonder who Moses was talking about. Was he not talking about Jesus Christ? This is Moses' words that Stephen used against the church. How do you defeat that? How do you beat it? Moses is the one that said there's another prophet coming. This Moses that you hold up, he's the one that made this statement. They can't beat it. And no doubt it's sitting in the back of their mind, eating at them. I don't know if y'all have ever been in a situation where maybe what you have been taught as a child is different than what the Bible actually says, but I've found myself in that situation a time or two before. And I've very much wanted to defend what I have been taught and have believed, at least up until that point in my life, because there's a family tie to that. My dad believed that. And if I begin to say that this is the way it is, if I change my mind now, I'm not just changing my mind and saying I don't believe what he used to believe and I believe this now. I'm saying my daddy was wrong. That can be a hard pill to swallow, right? These men are facing some of these things, but you've been defeated logically, and so this is eating at his mind. He says there was a church. Now notice this. In verse 38, he says, this is he talking about now this prophet that Moses talked about that would come later. This is that prophet. This is the one that was in the church in the wilderness. There was a church in the wilderness. What does that mean? There was a called out group of people in the wilderness. In other words, God had a remnant of people in the wilderness that believed in him, that were saved spiritually. And he said, with the angel which spake to him in the Mount Sinai, and with our fathers, who received the lively oracles. By the way, there's another verse or two here that I want you to notice. We've mentioned this verse here about the temple. We've kind of noticed that. But I want you to notice he makes the statement. Notice this in verse 38 where he says that in this church in the wilderness that he is with the angel which spake to him in Mount Sinai. The angel which spake to him in Mount Sinai. Verse 53, you notice this at the end of Stephen's message. He says, who have received the law. That was when the law was given on Mount Sinai. Who have received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. So what he's telling us is that when the law was given Mount Sinai, we know a couple of things about it. Again, the Bible is not extremely clear on all of this and how it worked. One, we know that God wrote the tables of stone with his finger, but it seems like the other oracles were given by angels. And so the Jewish people held up angels. And he's reminding them, hey, Jesus was over there too with the angels. This is that prophet. Why is all that important? Because this is chapter 7 of the book of Acts. In chapter 9, Paul's gathered up letters just a short time later. And he's headed down to Damascus. And on the road to Damascus, Jesus said, it's hard for thee to kick against the pricks. Had Paul ever, or Saul at this time, had Saul ever heard the gospel before? Well, we know for a fact he did. He heard it right here. He heard it from Stephen. He heard it from a man he killed. And now he's thinking about this. He's holding on to this idea, and he's remembering that he didn't defeat this argument that's still eating him up, and he killed the man that had preached it. Now I want you to. I'm not going to preach to you this morning that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. I believe with all my heart he did, for a few different reasons. One reason is because of linguistics. He tends to talk the same way and write the same way. Whoever wrote the book of Hebrews very closely ties to Paul, if it's not Paul himself, because of its linguistic nature. Some of the examples that are used, Paul tends to talk about the race that's set before us a lot. He does that in other books. He also, whoever wrote the book of Hebrews, uses the same type of examples. Now, I don't know if y'all listen to preaching much. It's kind of but stand out. You know, when I started preaching, we tend to use the same examples over and over again, right? And you listen to Brother Joe Lott preach, and you hear the natural examples that he uses. He tends to use the same ones over and over, because that's how the Lord's helped him to see the gospel. They see these things. It tends to work that way. So it's not all odd also to see a man writing the gospel to use the same examples over and over again. There's a couple of other things too. I want you to turn with me this morning to some scripture. And I'm going to do this very quickly. And I want you to see this picture. One of the last things that Stephen said in his message is about verse 47. He said, but Solomon built him a house, talking about God. Verse 48, howbeit the Most High dwelleth not in temples made with hands, saith the prophet. Now I want you to hold on. Just hold your place as we turn. Just hold your place in Acts 7 and turn real quick to Acts chapter 17. Acts 17. Paul here is preaching now. Saved, obviously. Missionary journey. He's preaching to the people in Athens at Mars Hill. Verse 24, he says, God that made the world and all things therein, seeing that he is the Lord of heaven and earth, dwelleth not in temples made with hands. Where did he hear that from? Where had he heard that? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? And we understand that that was a prophet that made that statement, but now that's ringing in Paul's ears. And he's reminded of who God is. Now you go back to Acts chapter 7 for a moment. You flip back there. And you see this in verse 37 that I've tried to highlight all the way through the message this morning. He tells us about Moses, and Moses said, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear. Listen to him. All right, now the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews, chapter 1. The book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 1. Hebrews 1, verse 1. God, who at sundry times and in divers manners spake in times past unto our fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken to us by his Son. Where did he get that idea from? Where'd that come from? Chapter 2, verse 1. Therefore, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard. From who? The Son. What's he saying? He's saying the same thing that Stephen said when he was preaching in front of the Sanhedrin council, that there's one coming after Moses that we need to listen to. He's the one that we need to hear. And then the children of Israel had lifted up Moses to a place. They had taken the law and lifted it up to a place that they thought they could behave well. And all of this, they had lifted up the angels who gave the law. Why is that important? Because in verse 7, if you go down back in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 7, he says that thou madest him, that's the Son who's spoken to us, that we ought to listen to. He says, thou madest him a little lower than the angels. Thou crownest him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet, for in that he put all in subjection under him, he hath nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not all the things put under him. What's he saying? He is better than the angels that gave the law. Where did he get that idea from? Stephen preached about it in Acts chapter 7. You know what chapter 3 of the book of Hebrews teaches rather? Probably one of my favorite verses. Verse 3, chapter 3, verse 3, for this man, that is this prophet, Christ, for this man was counted worthy of more glory than Moses, insomuch as he who had built the house hath more honor than the house. Christ is superior to Moses. Where did the writer of Hebrews get that idea from? The point that I'm making this morning, you kind of get this supposition and you remind yourself that all of Saul's life he's reminded of a message that a man preached that he killed. And that message has eaten. In Paul, in his mind, it's eating. And then Christ appears to him on Damascus Road and says it's hard to kick against the pricks. You know that this is the truth, and you can see it. You can feel that in your very spirit as the Lord would convict you. Just as you're here this morning and you're lost, and the Spirit of God is convicting you. You do the same thing that Paul did. So how am I saved? To me, Paul is one of the greatest witnesses of the message of Jesus Christ. They say, well, I need to be good enough to be saved. I don't know that a man could live higher and better than Paul lived. Touching the righteousness of the law, he was blameless. Any of y'all ever met that standard before? You cannot be good enough to be saved. You say, well, I've sinned too much. Paul was a murderer. And he didn't just kill anybody. He killed God's people. But he wasn't too bad. He was directly contrary to God, in opposition. You know, one of the best witnesses that you can have in a courtroom is one who's actually flipped sides, who used to be on one side, but came to the understanding, the realization of the truth and flipped sides. You put that man on the stand. That's Paul. One of the greatest witnesses. This morning, you don't have to take my word for it. Take Paul's word for it. Take the Lord's word for it. Believe. I don't know exactly how it all happened this morning, and I'm not telling you that I do, but it seems as if Paul was saved through the preaching of Stephen. You know, when you get saved, there is a nature of us that you tend to hold the preacher that was preaching when you got saved at a little bit higher regard. Paul killed his, if that's the case. See all this laid out. See all this before us. Sometimes, just for a moment, I'm going to try to come to a close. This morning, if you're here and saved, Stephen died doing what he thought he knew to do and never got to see the words come to life that he spoke and the end of what took place with them and how God used them, even after he was dead. Don't discount how great an effect your words have, even if you never see anything come to fruition with them. God's word will not return unto him void, but will accomplish that which it was sent forth to accomplish. And this morning, if you're lost, learn from Paul. You cannot be good enough to be saved. And you cannot live bad enough that God won't save you. But today, there is one means, one mode, one way of salvation, and that is the man Jesus Christ. And God sent him into this world that we could have eternal life. He sent him into the world to save us. Paul would say, to save sinners, of whom I am chief. Today, if you're lost, you need Jesus. So why wouldn't you ask him to save you? Why would you not submit yourself unto the King, the Lord of heaven? This morning, let's be reminded of what God's done for us through the Scripture just by looking at a man named Saul while we have a song.